All right, Module 3 continues now with Part 2. We've just defined how data sources can be created and the sources of data you can connect to. Now we focus on the data sets themselves. Now the data set represents an object of a query, really, and a query result that retrieves the data that your report needs. You can create one or more data sets in your report. They're uniquely named. They belong to a data source that has already been defined in your report, and they have a command type, which could be text, like a query, or if it's a relational system, it could be a stored procedure.
That's right.
You then have the query itself, so if you're using command type text, your query statement will be added to the query property. There are timeouts, and there are some options too about how to manage text collations and case sensitivity.
Yeah, I think an important point over here, Peter, is people often hear the term Power BI datasets, and those are the items that you build as part of your Power BI desktop reports and load up to the service. The term dataset here for paginated reports is a little bit different. Again, these are really flat tables of data that you're getting back via query. And one of the advantages, interestingly enough, is you can have multiple data sets from multiple Power BI data sets. So you can potentially have multiple different Power BI data sets feeding data into a singular paginated report.
Right.
So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. I know the term data set can be confusing, but if you just think of one in the context of paginated reports as a flat table versus a model, you'll be all set.
So just for clarity, that as we're working through this course, if we say data set, we mean paginated report dataset.
That's
if
right.
we say Power BI dataset, then
Yes.
we're referring to a dataset in your workspace.
We will clarify.
All right, now let's take a look at the query itself. So when that command type is text, you can enter a query. If you're proficient in writing SQL or DAX or MDX statements, then you can go ahead and use your favorite tool. Go ahead, write and craft that query and then copy and paste it in. What you'll find is that it's also possible to construct that query. In fact, you will have seen this in the demonstration when we used the wizard.
Yep.
The wizard actually gave us a query designer. We didn't need any skills in constructing a valid SQL statement. It did it for us.
Exactly.
Providing that you preview it and you're satisfied the result is correct, it should be good to go. Now, we did explore expressions being assigned to text box values and such forth. Here is a place where expressions can also be assigned, that query statement could be dynamically driven through some other logic in your report.
That's right.
All right, let's introduce then that there are these query designers that will support you in easily and quickly creating a valid query statement. Now, the designers allow you to do several things. In fact, you can explore the metadata of your data source. You can then, through drag-drop configurations, build up a query. When necessary, you can parameterize the query to allow users to define the filters. And you can also preview the query results. So the three designers are, there's one for Relational, only supported for Microsoft database products.
Yep.
And then for Analysis Services, there's a designer for DAX. Now, DAX stands for Data Analysis Expressions. It is the expression and query language for tabular models.
That's right.
And there's also the MDX, mind-destroying expressions query design. Oh, sorry, no, it's
I'm about to say, I hope he doesn't really believe that that's the case.
multi-dimensional expressions. Okay, just a side joke there. And it is the query language actually for multi-dimensional models. But the fact is, it wouldn't matter. Let's be very clear that a Power BI dataset is always a tabular model. If you're using SQL Server Analysis Services, it might so happen that you're using a multi-dimensional, or also known as a cube model. It won't matter which language you use. Analysis Services will allow you to use DAX to query multi-dimensional and MDX to query tabular. Okay, so there is a slight difference we'll come to in just a moment as to why you might choose one versus the other. With a focus then on the Relational Query Designer, well, it creates a select statement. We've seen this in demo already, that when you connect to your relational database, you could retrieve data from tables, views, even functions, in fact, if they're table valued. You can then configure the fields that you want by checking the columns to add to the query. You could turn it into a group by query and then bringing back an aggregated result. For example, group by year, group by customer, give me the count of orders. When you introduce columns from multiple tables, if there are foreign key constraints in place, then the joins will be automatically configured. If not, you'll have to go ahead and explain how the query will join the tables, and maybe you need to modify the join type.
That's right.
If it's an inner join, you might need to change it to right or full outer. Then you consider the filters or the where clause of your query. You can add the filters in and optionally parameterize them so that the user can pass values through them. The Query Designer also lets you switch from graphic mode.
That's right.
All right, so you might start in graphic mode and then you might want to further craft it by switching it to text mode.
I do that all the time.
All right, but I think you can't switch back, is that right?
Depending if you've made any changes, you can't switch back, depending on what those changes
So it might be a one-way change, but this is great. You get the basic query working and then you sort of fine-tune it to be precisely what you need.
Yep.
So this is what the Query Designer looks like. All right, when you've created your data set, you have the ability to build a query. So the Query Designer lets you expand tables to reveal columns, and then you just simply check to add them to selected fields. If you want to switch the query into a group by with summarization, you turn that on here, and then you determine which and how the fields will aggregate. If you need to interrogate, modify, or add to the relationships, it's actually hidden by default. You'll see that there's this chevron, this down-pointing chevron, and you can expand it to reveal the relationships and configure where necessary. Beneath it, you have the applied fields where you can add in your filter conditions, and optionally, by checking that checkbox, you can parameterize them. Across the top, when you're ready to preview the result, you have the run query. When you need to switch across to the text view, you've got that here.
Yes.
And it's also possible that you can import from a query file. Now, that could be a collaboration that the database administrator might be your friend. I need to build a report that does this. Could you please build the query for me? I don't have those skills. And they could hand it off as a .sql file, and then you'd simply import it in. Moving next to the Analysis Services Designers. Remember, there are two, the MDX and the DAX. All right, these are required when building a data set on a Power BI data set, and you can use it also for Azure Analysis Services and SQL Server Analysis Services.
Well, for the Power BI dataset, you would use it if you're using the XMLA endpoint specifically. There is the option to choose the Power BI dataset directly, but if you're using XMLA, definitely want to use Analysis Services.
All right. If you're familiar with MDX, it could potentially return a multi-dimensional data set. The reason that I raise this is that the designer goes to great lengths to two-dimensionalize that data set. Reporting Services only understands 2 dimensions, and that's in terms of fields. Fields are like your columns and then the rows of data.
Exactly.
So what the query is doing, and the designer is doing a great job of coercing a multi-dimensional structure into something that's 2-dimensional that Reporting Services can work with. All right, the designers allow constructing a query statement in either language. Take care that models, whether they're tabular or multidimensional, must have measures defined. So if you want to bring in sales results, you'll need a measure defined in the model to do so. There are 2 development modes. You have design mode and query mode. In design mode, it allows you to drag drop. In query mode, it's like a text editor. All right, so we use the DAX Query Designer to construct and test a DAX query. You can drag and drop model resources to construct your query. Those resources could be columns, hierarchies, levels, measures, and even KPI metrics. You can add filters with optional parameterization, and then if you need to, you could switch to design mode, and then you could tamper with the query statement that has been built.
That's right.
So this is what it looks like. The Query Designer in DAX mode. What you see here is the ability to select the model. Now this won't apply to Power BI desktop models, will it?
No, it would not. You'd only have a single model.
It'll only apply actually to multidimensional, where a database could have multiple, or actually tabular if there are perspectives.
That's right.
Then they're available from here as well. But once you've made that selection to a model or a perspective of a model, then the metadata pane is going to express to you all of the structure in terms of measures and tables and columns and hierarchies and levels. And it really is just a matter of finding the resource and dropping it into the query pane, whereupon you can preview the query results.
Yep.
Here we go. Now, like the Relational Designer, you could also import a DAX query from a file. You might change your mind and say, I now want to work in MDX mode.
Be careful, though. You'll throw out all your work if you do that.
That's right. You'll have to start from scratch again. There is a capability to enable or disable auto-execute. Now, I think it's disabled by default, but if you want that query preview to update every time you drag something in, then you can enable it, and then you can get an instant preview happening. You've got the ability to re-execute that query. You could switch across to the design mode, And there's also the ability to enable multi-value parameters.
Yes, you can. One of the great things with this is you can use parameters very easily using the graphic designer with the DAX query design.
Right, and we talk about parameters in the next module, but it does a lot of auto-configuration for you.
That's right.
Such that parameters and mappings are all created with just the click of a button.
That's right.
All right, and then filter pane here just above the query results. So this is where you can add in your filter conditions, and it's not in view, but if you horizontally scroll, there's a checkbox where you're going to say that that filter is also a parameter.
Yes.
All right, moving next to the MDX query designer, there are many similarities, in fact, that connecting to a model or a perspective of a model allows you to drag drop model resources like columns, hierarchies, levels, measures, and KPIs. So nothing different there. But what is different is the ability to use MDX to construct what is known as a calculated member. So you can inject a calculation into your query statement, perhaps compensating for something that the model, your report needs that the model doesn't directly offer. All right, so the designer looks much the same, except notice at the bottom left, there's a pane for calculated members. They can be created, and then you can drag those calculated members into your query result. MDX works a little differently, so there's the ability to turn on or off empty cells that might be retrieved. There's a specific capability in MDX, and you'll see this in demonstration later, a very special behavior that says if you're going to achieve summarization in your report design, the logic that will achieve summarization will actually be pushed back into the query itself, so that the summarization happens in Power BI.
Yes.
That we're not repeating summarization logic in our report design, potentially, summarizing the dataset results. We're actually saying to Power BI, you compute the summarization, send it back.
Definitely see a performance improvement there.
Right. So both things, performance improvement, but also accuracy, and no need to duplicate logic at report level. Yep. The logic remains in the model in that single version of truth. If you're not happy with the MDX mode and you've changed your mind again, well, you can scratch everything you've done and you can switch back to the DAX mode. So that completes the discussion on the three graphic designers that we have. To complete the discussion on datasets, there are three collections of objects. And they are the fields, the filters, and the parameters. So the fields represent, in a sense, the columns that are returned by your query result. And these fields are mapped into your report layout to display values being returned by the dataset. Now, the dataset also supports filtering and parameters. The filters are used to filter the data that has been retrieved by Power BI. And the parameters allow injecting filter conditions into the query so that it brings back only the data that the report needs. This is probably better explained with some animations coming in just a short moment. All right, so in the dataset properties page, the fields page represents the tabular structure of your dataset. What's interesting here is expressions have a role to play.
That's true.
That you can also extend the fields collection by using an expression to create a calculated field. When it comes to filters, remember they are used to filter the data that has already been retrieved. So this way, your report design can operate over a subset of the dataset rows. Now, why might this be of interest to you? Let's see by example then.
Yes.
A report user is saying, I want to see sales for 2019. Now, your report design could retrieve data for all years. Now, that's not terribly optimal, but what you're anticipating as a report author is that they're going to switch between different years. So see what happens is that Power BI will render that report by filtering the data that has already been retrieved.
That's right.
And when the report user decides that, yes, they now want to see a different year by 2020, that filtered data set remains, and just a different filter is applied.
And this is a very similar concept to what you do with the Power BI report today. And when you're clicking on your filters and slicers, it's already pulled all that data back, and you're just moving through the data that it's already pulled to show different views of it.
Well, in my thinking, I would use this technique when I anticipate that I want reuse out of that retrieved data. Look, if I had 50 years of data and I only anticipate that they might do 1 or 2 years, you're just going to have to weigh up, what is the most efficient way to do this, both in terms of the resources in the Power BI capacity, but also the time for the report user. You see, if you're going to retrieve all years of data, that could be an expensive and slow thing to do, and your report user is spending a minute waiting for that.
Yes.
So factor in the requirements and the facts that you have before you. And in some situations, it's more efficient to do this. Retrieve everything and then filter it.
It's really when you're expecting the user to use it on the web versus, say, setting up a subscription for it, because then it wouldn't make much sense.
So, Chris, how long does that data remain cached in the service for reuse?
So it's interesting you bring that up, Peter. So one of the things that we've gotten feedback around is people are confused that after a certain amount of time, and they try to interact with the report, we say, sorry, your session has expired. We do that specifically to protect users in the terms of their capacity to make sure those resources are freed up after a certain amount of time. So as long as you're doing anything interacting with the report, even moving your mouse in the context of viewing that report, we keep that session open. If you have 10 minutes of inactivity, we close the session out behind the scenes, and then when you try to interact with it, you get a message saying you need to refresh your session. This will make sure that you don't actually continue consuming those resources, and that's the amount of time that your data will be available for you. But as long as you're interacting with it, it'll be available for each time in your session.
Great. Okay, so let's refine the guidelines there. That this is a suitable design approach that you anticipate that a data set could be reused within a 10-minute period.
Yes.
Okay. So the other consideration for filtering data is that you could push the filter condition back to the data source itself, and that's what parameterization means. So this is commonly used, in fact, it's the default arrangement, as we'll learn in the next module, that when we have report parameters that prompt the user for a value, like a sales order number, that value is actually passed into the query that then Power BI passes to the data source. So let's see it by example here. In fact, it's the same example that the user requests the report for 2019. Now, in this report design, Power BI simply retrieves the data for 2019 by taking that report parameter value and pushing it into the where clause of the query. And so it's only retrieving what it needs, renders the report, and delivers it to the user. If the user then modifies their request to year 2020, then a new set of data is retrieved.
That's right.
And the report is rendered from it.
Yes.
So this could be more efficient. In fact, both techniques are good for the right circumstances.
Yeah. I think in general with paginated reports, people will find that using parameters is the optimal scenario because, again, you're not doing the heavy lifting there in the context of the service, but rather letting the database do the heavy lifting and just filtering your data down to the set you need.
Right. So, last topic here. When it comes to securing data, you've got the ability to secure like row-level security per user.
Exactly. So when you're developing your report, as we've mentioned earlier, you have that global field, which is the user ID field. And you can pass that field to a query parameter. And you can even have that hidden from the end user so they don't have to choose their user ID at the time. We'll just recognize who you are and pass that user principal name once you get into the service back down to the data source, then give you the data back that you would have the ability to see.
Right. So it would imply that your database would know what to do with a UPN.
That's right.
Remember, it's just a text value. It could be peter.myers@mycompany.com. And so providing your data has that stored, let's just imagine a salesperson table and you have their email address stored against them. And then you could join that to the sales facts, therefore only allowing the report to retrieve sales that have taken place by that individual.
And this is one of the advantages of using the Power BI datasets, because if you set up the row-level security in the context of your Power BI dataset, which you have the ability to do directly there in the service versus needing to do it at the data source itself, you'll be able to take advantage of that with your paginated reports.
All right, so what we're saying there is, if your source is a Power BI dataset, there's nothing you need to do.
That's right.
If there's row-level permissions already enforced on that model, it'll just naturally happen. The user requesting the report, their identity will be used by Power BI. But where your data, for example, is sitting in Azure SQL database, then it would require us to have a table
That's right.
that somehow stored the UPN, that we could use it in a query to achieve the correct filtering.
That's true.
Okay, so the user ID is useful in that situation where we need to pass, perhaps as a query parameter, into the query to achieve that specific filter for the user. And just that reminder, remember that the user ID field, built-in field, returns a different value in Report Builder as it does to the Power BI service.
Yes.
So just make sure you thoroughly test your row-level permissions once you've published the report to the service.
Just keep that in mind.
All right, well then, I think we've arrived at the end of the dataset discussion. Yes. I think we can wrap up, Chris, with some recommendations. So what do you think of the first one?
I think that's a good idea. I mean, because of the way that data is used in the context of paginated reports, that if people are coming from, say, SQL Server reporting services or Power BI report server, they may be using a data source to go natively against versus having a Power BI desktop model that we don't have support yet for in the service. If that's the case, you can use a Power BI desktop model to pull that data in there and then use that as the source for your paginated report.
All right, so Chris is referring to using a Power BI dataset.
Yes.
Okay, so a Power BI dataset allows us to work with the great features of Power BI and Power BI Desktop, the row-level permissions we've just discussed, but the ability then to connect to data sources that currently Power BI Paginated Reports cannot connect directly to.
Yeah, for example, if you're using ODBC, which is oftentimes used for a number of different data sources on-prem, we don't have native support for that. So you would just use Power BI Desktop to create a data set, publish it up to the service, and connect to that.
So you might find for your first paginated report, task 1 is create the model.
That's exactly
And task 2, now I can connect to and report from it. This topic is one that I like because I do a lot of work with relational reporting, is that I prefer to put my logic in stored procedures when possible, so if you have the skills and the permissions to do so, because it allows often for better performance and reuse of logic across multiple reports. And I like the ease of maintenance that, sometimes if you don't break the interface to the report by removing or renaming columns, you can tweak with the query without even having to republish the report in the Power BI service.
Yeah, and I know there's been some comments or questions around if you can use stored procedures effectively with paginated reports in the service. And we've done a number of testing and walked through a number of scenarios recently. And for most scenarios, you should be able to use stored procedures even if they're using interactive parameters through the Power BI gateway or if you're using Azure SQL Database.
Great. And then our last recommended practice to take on board is that if you are connecting with one of the Analysis Services sources, whether it's a Power BI dataset or Azure or SQL Analysis Services, the recommendation is use the DAX query designer unless you have a specific need to work with server aggregates or to create calculated members in MDX.
Yeah, but it's really a performance thing at this point because you will see better performance if you're using DAX and a number of different parameters you're passing through. You will see better performance there than if you're using MDX.
Well, I think we're ready for another demonstration.
Oh, I hope so.
So in our next demonstration, we'll put all of this together, defining data sources and data sets, and then we'll build out a complete report for the AdventureWorks company.
Looking forward to it.